Hello, today is May 10th, 2023, and we'll talk about two architects, both born on May 10th. We'll start with Antonin Raymond, was born in 1887, 1 year younger than Le Corbusier, and died in 1976. Let's read a little bit about him. But before, let's see some pictures with him. I mentioned earlier that he was an architect very appreciated by Kenneth Frampton. And here he is with his wife and with an interesting belt for his pants. Rather romantic and unusual. I like them here. So Antonin Raymond, he was Czech. Antonin Raymond, born as Antonin Raymond, born on the 10th of May 1888, the Kingdom of Bohemia, and died in November 1976 in Pennsylvania, the United States. Was a Czech-American architect. Raymond was born and studied in Bohemia, now part of the Czech Republic, working later in the United States and Japan. Raymond was also the consul of Czechoslovakia to Japan from 1926 to 1939. Incredible. So in 1926, he was 38 years old. And until 1939, so for 13 years, he was the consul of Czechoslovakia to Japan. Very unusual, no, for an architect. Well, very unusual for many people, but I don't know of any other architect to be, to have a political, position of this amplitude for so many years, 13 years. In which year, meaning 1939, the Czech diplomacy was closed down after the occupation of the European country by Nazi Germany. His initial work with American architects Cass Gilbert and Frank Lloyd Wright gave him all insight into the use of concrete for texture and structure that he would refine throughout his 6-decade career. Now we know that concrete pollutes a lot, but at his time, during his time, this was not an issue. At studio practices in New Hope, Pennsylvania and Tokyo, he explored traditional Japanese building techniques combined with the latest in American building innovations. Raymond applied these principles to a wide range of residential, commercial, religious, and institutional projects in Japan, America, India, and the Philippines, along with British architect Josias Conder. I don't know of him, but I don't know of many things. Raymond is recognized as one of the fathers of modern architecture in Japan. Now look at that. So an architect born in Czechoslovakia and living later in Japan and the United States, he's considered one of the fathers of modern architecture in Japan. Please do not forget this, Antonin Raymond. Ignored by Henry Russell Hitchcock Jr. and Philip Johnson in their curatorial celebration of the international style in 1932, this is what Kenneth Frampton wrote, and despite the homecoming exhibition of his work staged in the Rockefeller Center in 1939 and the AIA New York chapter Medal of Honor that was awarded to him 17 years later in 1956, the AIA is the American Institute of Architects, one has the feeling that Raymond's achievements were always somehow grudgingly received by his compatriots. And even now, over 50 years later, there remains a silent consensus in the field that is reluctant to acknowledge the unrivaled excellence and breathtaking scope of Raymond's architectural career. So, from the eminent critic and theoretician, very uplifting words towards Raymond, Antonin Raymond. So let's look at some of his works. Tokyo Women's Christian College in Tokyo, 1921, 1938. We'll look at the chapel auditorium from 1934. And indeed, it's a very fine work. There are some influences here from Perret, Auguste Perret, but what do we see here? We see concrete, a vigorous structure, but we also see the sensitivity of the treatment of the windows. So the windows become ornamental. And while they do not have a narrative, the kind of stained glass windows in the Gothic cathedrals had, they still evoke a different kind of glasswork that compared to what we are accustomed to today. So I like the relationship between the vigor of the concrete structural work and the sensitivity of the large glasswork, meaning the large windows of this chapel. He also employed color, and is not bad. So you see, you can do a lot with glass if you escape the temptation to use just one single piece of glass without any character, in the name of allowing as much light as possible and as much space as possible into your eye or into your inner space. But I think the light and space are also they are not just determined by quantitative attributes, but also qualitative. So a large space is not necessarily a good space. Whatever Jean Nouvel said, he said a nice apartment is a large apartment. Well, I had seen large apartments which were not so nice, and I had seen small apartments which are nice. So again, just the simple fact that a space is big or huge doesn't guarantee, a very architectural, a positive or qualitative space. And it's the same with light. You can be flooded with light, but if that light is not filtered in a certain way, it's not, nuanced, well, it could be even bothering. So not everything that is big is good. Sometimes what is small is good. And, those windows that Antonin Raymond did for this chapel in Tokyo, I think could make us think about what a window is. Because you see, it's a window that filters light and is almost an impressionistic window because of its fragmentation. It's almost embroidered, almost. This part, there are some influences you can see from Frank Lloyd Wright. He's not as free as Frank Lloyd Wright, a little bit stiff, but maybe exactly because of it, somehow interesting. Is he breathtaking, as Kenneth Frampton said? I don't know. I wouldn't really consider his work breathtaking, but is worthy of our attention. A house in Tokyo, 1924. Now this one is interesting and unexpected in its asymmetry and almost radical in its austerity and asymmetry. Antonin Raymond. The architect was ignored by Hitchcock and not the film director, but the art historian and critic, and Philip Johnson, when they created that famous international style exhibition, and they totally ignored Antonin Raymond. Here is the plan of the house. Rather unusual, those curved corners, or the major well, is only the left lower corner, but not only, because you see on the right side also there is an entrance with the rounded corners. The corner is always a problem in architecture. It's besides the, I mean, in many ways, an architecture defines itself through how you solve the problem of the corner, because the corner is not just the place where two walls meet, as the important North American writer Salinger said in one of his writings, and he received the Nobel Prize for Literature. And in one of his writings, I forgot which one, not that I read a lot, but that one I read. He said, do you know what a wall says to another wall? And the answer was, meet you at the corner. So indeed, the corner is that place where a wall meets another wall, and it's the most problematic part of the building, because it's also the most vulnerable to the elements. Time itself hits the most in the corner, you know, and it's also on one hand, it's the most assertive, the corner, because it's a summum there of two walls. And at the same time, it's the most vulnerable, it's the most fragile. Maybe that's why Louis Sullivan emphasized the corner with his phantasmagoric ornamentation. But here with Antonin Raymond, we see the curving of the corner to make it maybe less assertive, more gentle. Anyway, this house deserves some attention. And as I said, you know, well, I said, it wasn't me who said it. We read what Frampton said, that this man actually was able to bring together various influences. And here is the power of his architecture, but also its weakness, because, you know, it's kind of a hybrid architecture, and hybridity is not a bad thing, actually. It depends. It depends. Frank Lloyd Wright probably would have dismissed this idea that hybridity is a good thing, because hybridity is close to conglomeration. And in the case of concrete, Frank Lloyd Wright, for example, didn't like concrete because he named it a conglomerate. He wanted something more pure and more organic, not you know, almost an artificial adding of various parts. Hoshi University main building in Tokyo, 1924. Again, an architecture of convention almost, not radical, not extravagant. Although he did some interesting things, we are going to see them. Erisman residence in Yokohama, again. Now, how he received these commissions in Japan, I guess through his diplomatic activities, because he was a consul of Czechoslovakia in Japan, and he had relations with diplomatic relations with other diplomats, and that's how he received commissions, being an architect. I don't know. I mean, you know, this kind of building doesn't make us, you know, say wow, but maybe there is a quality exactly in this that is not a radical architecture. It's still, maybe it's a Japanese-ness derives exactly from this. Although we know that Japan was and is a field of experimental architecture, a lot of audacity. We don't see a lot of audacity here unless we consider the import of European or North American models into Japan. Japan did this. Often it was influenced by you know, what happened outside of it. That is after 1850, when the country opened up to the world. Before that was in good measure almost a feudal island, cut off from the rest of the world in its exceptionalism. Oh, these shutters of the windows, you wouldn't really expect them like this and colored like this in Japan. Anyway, who knows? The diplomat was probably not Japanese, so the building tried to respond to some requirements coming from a different culture, perhaps, although the building was built in Japan. Antonin Raymond. Great trees, great trees. Here is an exhibition that took place in this house. It was not done by Antonin Raymond, but I thought of including it in the presentation because it shows a very refined taste that the Japanese have for, subtle things, for discreetness, for I mean, it's a lesson in l'esprit de finesse. It's an art. I don't know, a landscape architect or an artist. No, I think an artist. This show. I hope I have. Let's see, just a second. Yes, I mean here I have some images of this show. I spent some time to add some more images, but let's read a little bit about it because I think it's important. The exhibition is inside the Erisman house in Yokohama, which was built by Antonin Raymond. This White Forest exhibition was by Mono, I guess an artist or a cooperative of artists, Japanese. Mono designed the artwork White Forest, which was exhibited in Erisman's house, one of old Western style houses authorized as a historical architecture by Yokohama city government as a formal program of the festival Harmony of Flower and Table in Yamate of Yokohama City, Japan. So to try under the theme of fresh flower design and table decoration, we had a special guest, Miss Madoka Shimazu, flower and table decoration coordinator, and created the artwork with her in collaboration. The title is White Forest. I guess that's what the Mono wrote. With a fictional story that a lot of trees surrounding Erisman House in the park extend into this interior space, we set two kinds of flowers. One was paper art, as analogy for memories of this 80s house, and another was living plants as for people's lives in the present. This artwork was perfectly a new exhibition for lifestyle with a collaboration of space art, fresh, I guess it's written wrongly, fresh flower and table decoration. And, I admire this kind of work because it's very subtle, it's discreet, it's about flowers, but it's also about decoration, about ornamentation, and it's about the fragility of existence and the beauty of nature. And I think these things need to be continuously remembered. Otherwise, we just build structures, and we forget the other side of not just architecture, but life itself. A very fine work, done with green plants, flowers, fresh flowers, but there are also artificial flowers here from what we read, and look at the treatment of the windows, an installation by some artists. Ornament, almost like in a Herzog and de Meuron building. Can you imagine the minuteness required to do something like this? Ephemeral art, but it's carpe diem. You live in the present, you live in the moment, and you try to do a thing as well as possible. A sensitive thing. Japan, in the house built by Antonin Raymond, one of the fathers of modern architecture in Japan, a foreigner, a consul from Czechoslovakia. Again, he didn't do this work. Mono did, those artists from Japan. The Italian embassy villa in Nikko, 1929. We remember that Villa Savoie by Le Corbusier was built in 1928, so this was 1 year later. Let's look at the Italian embassy villa. Not bad. Actually, I like this building. I like its lack of ostentation, and also its echoes of the traditional art of building in Japan. But it's not just Japanese, and yet it is Japanese. It's a very fine work, I think. It's called the Villa for the Italian embassy. But I feel tempted to study this work carefully, because I think Antonin Raymond here does show his skill to combine, to unite what we call the past with what we call the present. It's fascinating in a way, no, that a foreigner coming from Czechoslovakia, who was a consul, here he was, arriving at the status of being one of the fathers of modern architecture in Japan. I like very much this veranda. It's a linear, long, it's kind of almost like a second living room, very long, approximately narrow. And then the window, also the way it was done, divided into those small squares. I think this space would have been very, pleasant. And I think something like this can be done very easily, for example, in other parts of the world, including our country. And yet, there is modernity here. It's not just tradition, it's not just turning one's head towards the past, but there is also modernity, yes. This is one of his best buildings, in my opinion, Antonin Raymond. We see here a website, nearly synthesis of East-West design, Antonin Raymond. It sounds strange, a nearly synthesis. Well, almost a synthesis of East and West design by this Czech architect, Antonin Raymond. British Embassy Memorial Villa, similar, almost too much similar to the villa for the Italian embassy. This is for the British embassy. And yes, these two buildings, I think, are almost mysterious in the simplicity. I myself should be more silent and investigate the buildings more, because they attract me. Yes, this blending, this mixture of East and West is clearly the sign of of a significant talent. And maybe we need such infusions of the other in our own work. Another villa in Nikko, 1931. Not always I found the best pictures, but I think I have here also in this presentation his own house. Tokyo Golf Club in Osaka, 1932. Well, architects cannot avoid for too long working for the rich, and the rich like to play golf. What can we do about it? Including ex-President Donald Trump, and including Constantin Brâncuș, who spent his last years of his life rather often on the golf course. And he, in his atelier in Paris, the building built by Renzo Piano in front of Centre Georges Pompidou, there are the tools of playing golf right there. I don't know how they are called, but yes, Brâncuș loved golf. But all I thought about it, and forgive my sincerity, which is maybe not very diplomatic, but sincerity very often is not quite diplomatic or well chosen. But I thought of it, many sports are very erotical in nature. I mean, most of them are about throwing a ball into a hole, into HOLE, handball, football, golf. It's all about hitting, arriving at a hole, and I don't know, it's something a little bit so explicit and also so strange that. Anyway, I think half of the sports in the world are like this. Maybe it's a deviant sexuality. Maybe this could be the definition of sport. Deviant or oblique sexuality. Or I see things completely wrongly. That is also possible. I mean, why the fascination to throw or to hit a ball from far away to enter a little hole, in the ground, which is beyond the hill or something like this? What is the fascination in football I mean, did you see the joy of the football players after they create a goal? They hit the net of the gate, or I don't know how they are called actually in English, but you understand. It's like they reached God Himself. That the joy is immense, and I wonder why. In essence, it's not something so. I mean, you could look at it with cold blood, but that's not what happens. And those who hit the hole, they are considered heroes, and hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, celebrate that the little ball entered the hole. Enough about the golf. Summer house, another. This one I think is for him. Yes. So 1933, Antonin Raymond built this summer house in Karuizawa. I don't know if I pronounce well. And it's an interesting house. I hope I have other pictures. Yeah. It's really a fine house, an interesting house. No, this architect was quite something. And can you imagine he did all of this while he was also a consul in the embassy? In black and white is also good, the work. And yes, maybe you would agree with Kenneth Frampton that it is breathtaking, because, even the employment of the trunk of a tree without disciplining it into becoming a round, perfectly vertical column in itself could be considered, rather unconventional and breathtaking. Not to speak about the covering with plants of those top parts of the building. So you could say this is a very ecological building, no? A very sustainable building. It is a building. It is the work of man, but it's not aggressively distancing itself from nature. It is. I'm beginning to agree with Kenneth Frampton on this. His own house. Summer house, Karuizawa, 1933. He was still a consul at the time. I also like these coverings of the windows towards the outside. You know, very gentle, very flexible, very organic and modest and efficient at the same time. I need something like this myself. I should remember. I need for some windows which are too close to the street to cover them like this. Not bad. Antonin Raymond, Summer House, 1933. And look at the foundations or the pedestal. I don't know if I can call it pedestal on which the house rests. You know, it's with the simplest means, and it works. It's elevated a little bit from the earth. The only, strange thing that I find, if I'm allowed to call it so, is this corner here. I consider it an unskillfulness. But maybe I'm too conventional. That this horizontal meets the diagonal at this angle here, and I wonder why. But I guess we didn't mind it. I don't know. I find this something that would almost unavoidably make the professor, a little anxious, maybe. Otherwise, it's a very fine building. A great living room. He was doing well, Antonin Raymond. We see there the typical architects supporting legs for the drafting board. When you see something like this, you are in the close proximity of design and architecture, almost unavoidably. Another house, 1933 in Tokyo, but no pictures. This one is also in Tokyo. I like his house more than this. Now in 1939, the Raymond farm in New Hope. So we are away from Japan. And I guess this is in Pennsylvania. Something happened to him. I think what he did in Japan was superior to what we see here. Maybe here he just refurbished an existing building. It's possible, a farm, and now is I don't know, workshops take place there, architects, students. It's some kind of a foundation that he founded because he died. This is the building. Now, of course, this is not a building designed by Antonin Raymond. So yeah, it was an existing building that he used for this foundation and for his own activities. St. Joseph the Worker Church, Victoria City, Negros, the Philippines, 1949. I know he left to the United States because of the Second World War. I don't know exactly when he left, during the war or immediately after the war, and then he returned to Japan. he probably loved Japan, and he lived for more years in Japan. This is in Philippines, a church. We see here again the decorative, the ornamental panel that filters the light. And even here we see kind of a porous wall. It's an interesting building. And I like even the naive, narrative done by a painter on this facade of the building. It's okay. And, narration, pictorial narration takes place inside as well. Okay, and now Raymond House and Studio, Azabu, 1951. Back in Japan, in 1951, he built a smaller house for himself, studio, house and studio, 1951. Antonin Raymond. And no, this picture I saw, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's the same building. No, I think it's a different building, but this picture belongs to the previous house that he built for himself, that summer house. Sorry about the presence of this picture here. Reader's Digest offices in Tokyo, 1951. So, the American presence in Japan after 1945 was heavily felt. So Reader's Digest built offices in Tokyo, not much later after the war ended. And here it is. And I like this building too. It's in Japan. It's built by a Czech American architect, but and the building is for an American publication, Reader's Digest, but the building has a Japanese personality, I would say. And I like that it is not assuming, it's not very assertive. It's not a typical office building. Reader's Digest building in Tokyo, 1955. A not particularly striking image of the building, designed by Antonin Raymond, who had had an architectural practice in Japan before the Pacific War. But the building under construction from 1949 to 1951 was transforming on multiple levels. While Raymond used the latest concrete construction techniques available at the time, he also sought to blend traditional Japanese and modern Western architecture to follow, I quote, the Japanese respect for proper orientation, closeness to nature, and use of material in their natural state, including sculpting the landscape into bulbous mounds with a stream and a reservoir added for natural air conditioning. Nice. Natural air conditioning. Perhaps we should think about this. Cunningham House, Tokyo, 1954. A little different, these houses, from what he built before the war. Let's remember, Antonin Raymond is considered one of the fathers of modern architecture in Japan, although he was not Japanese. Saint Anselm's Church in Tokyo, 1954. It's quite a church. I mean, in terms of dimensions. But we see again his artistry in filtering light in more complex and subtle ways. Otherwise, exposed concrete. I understood that Japan, in its efforts for reconstruction, became one of the most they use the most concrete in the construction, and indeed, many buildings in Japan are built with concrete, and we know the Polish concrete of Tadao Ando, but many modern architects employed concrete a lot in Japan. And here is Antonin Raymond also employing exposed concrete. But it's a fine building, and with a fine abstract or modern, decorative art. Again, we see the fact that he was reluctant to leave a large piece of glass all by itself. So he brought ornament to the glass. And that's what we look at here. In our time, probably most architects would have employed a very large piece of glass and that's it. But that was not his sensibility. Good for him. And yes, stained glass window. It's a church after all. Abstract as it is. Designed handle for the door. I like the fact that in Japan, but not only in Japan, modern architecture brought to sacred architecture the raw concrete, the exposed concrete, and in many instances, the clients, so to speak, didn't protest. And I think it's correct not protesting, because religion, like any spiritual work, needs some austerity, to soften and embellish excessively and make it sweet. In my opinion, is not quite appropriate for the stringencies of spiritual work. It's a good building, this one by Antonin Raymond, yes. And we have the wood of the benches and the concrete of the structure of the building. And then we have innovations here. Look at this stairs. And that little window has the sign of the cross in it. Even the handrail is interesting. And it's just a so-called detail. Not bad. Antonin Raymond, one of the fathers of modern architecture in Japan. Mayo River State Park in Rockingham County. This is in the United States, but I don't know. The building is a fundamentalist building. It's a raw, primal, elemental architecture that I like very much. It's not a very big building, but it's monumental because of how it is crystallized as an architectonic so-called solution. Interesting architect, no doubt. Even his name is interesting, you know, because you think with this name, Antonin Raymond, it sounds almost French, but he was Czech. Well, even a good building comes to an end. And that's it about him today. So let's talk a little bit about him, because I think it's important to talk a little bit about Antonin Raymond.